few weeks ago, Disney had its last first gay kiss. In the Quinceañero episode of High School Musical: The Musical the series, Seb and Carlos kissed. This was an important gesture for the couple, and also another step forward for representation in what might be one of the most queer-inclusive Disney shows to date. In High School Musical: The Musical the series, multiple actors who played lead roles are proudly out as part of the queer spectrum. It's also one of the first Disney things to acknowledge the fluidity of gender.
Ladies, gentlemen, or however else you identify.
In addition, two main characters are not only in an openly gay relationship, but their existence isn't dependent on a tragic backstory about how they couldn't find acceptance. They deal with things, but not because they're queer. But this was Disney's last first gay kiss, or at least I hope so. Let me explain. In 2017, Disney's first gay kiss appeared on Star vs. the Forces of Evil. Technically. And by that, I mean there was a scene in which you could see two background extras kissing, something that you might not catch unless you pause it. You can count the one from Hunchback 2 if you want, but I just don't really consider either of these kisses relevant, and that's kind of the whole reason why I'm making this video in the first place. And of course, there was last year's Pixar short Out that featured a gay couple and a kiss. In terms of other recent shows with representation, there's also been Andy Mack and The Owl House. But why is this important in the first place? Well, representation matters. And for people growing up in cis heteronormative societies, seeing openly queer characters isn't just a sign of hope. It's a sign that things are possible. Maybe I would have understood that I'm non-binary years before I did if I had ever heard of trans identities growing up. Sometimes coming out isn't a matter of finding yourself, but instead finding words to describe your feelings, and representation is an important part of that. That being said, I think sometimes it's also possible to give words too much power, so much so that they lose meaning. A few weeks ago, Disney released Cruella, which was reported to have the first openly gay character in one of their movies. However, the quote-unquote openly gay character just wore makeup and effeminate clothing and hinted at it, but didn't really say anything explicit about being gay or queer. This resulted in a lot of backlash, with people complaining about how Disney shouldn't advertise characters as LGBTQ when they're not. But it's a bit more complicated than that. It seems the notion that Artie is queer comes from one of the first scripts. According to actor John McCrea, who is queer, the character was originally a drag queen. In one of the original scripts, he was the drag queen. So I think he was always intended to be queer representing, I suppose, or somehow a member of the LGBTQ community. I imagine that was always the case. This, combined with a tweet from Grace Randolph, seems to have started the storm about Disney's latest first gay character. And that's a bit different than Disney issuing an official press statement about their first gay character. But there's also more context, because there have been announcements about the first gay character in Disney media. Plenty of them, in fact. But each time there's something slightly different. There are different wordings for it, and the goalpost shifts. First gay character to say I'm gay, first openly gay character in an animated movie, first openly gay protagonist, the list goes on. But these usually get shortened to just first gay character in the media. Disney gets praised, people get upset, and the cycle repeats. And this is ignoring the actual times that gay people have been referenced in Disney films.
Antoine Soussan of Paris plays the harp. No title, but good family.
What about the title husband?
Yeah, he's cute.
His boyfriend thinks he's handsome also.
Right on.
Or even the fact that the first Disney character actually implied to be queer was from 1938. Given Disney's history of queer-coding characters, it's disappointing to see a character start out as a drag queen and just get watered down from there. It's even more disappointing to see this happen in 2021, the year that Disney Plus has a really wonderful Pride special and multiple queer-inclusive shows. And after a certain number of characters have been labeled or implied to be some part of Disney's strides towards LGBTQ acceptance, only to have a single line of dialogue or be barely noticeable, it makes me wonder what the phrase first gay character even means anymore. Because for me, it doesn't have much meaning. What started out as a plea for agency and representation seems to have just turned into a rebranding of queer coding, crumbs of representation labeled as a whole meal. And when you have this happening alongside legitimately wonderful queer inclusive Disney media, it's no surprise to me that the messaging gets lost in the mix. And I think a similar thing is happening with the kiss from High School Musical: The Musical the series.
Y'all, Disney just had their first gay kiss, and it's with two queer actors, and all during Pride Month, intertwined with Latinx culture. It's wild to think that it is historical, but I love it. It's awesome.
And of course, we were game and so excited to take part in Disney history, which is
crazy to say.
Yeah, and I think it was time.
And though it wasn't technically the first gay kiss for Disney, did the one from Star vs. the Forces of Evil even count? What about the one from Hunchback 2? Does it count as representation if you have to pay attention to notice it, or if it's between a gargoyle and a goat? Depends on who you ask. But I'd say we don't just need representation, we need good representation. And with that in mind, the kisses from Out and High School Musical: The Musical: The Series are much more important to me. There were points in the past where even just having a queer character, regardless of how they fit in the story, was a step forward. But now we live in a world where companies use any semblance of representation to masquerade as good representation. And this results in social media profiles filled with pride flags and merch throughout the month of June, but little support or acknowledgement of queerness any other time of the year. The message is different than having no acknowledgement at all, but it is isolating in a new way. We'll acknowledge you when it's financially and politically convenient for us. I've made videos in the past talking about the redundance of the whole first gay character dilemma, and that certainly applies to the first gay kiss as well. And this stuff is important. This channel is about Disney music, and High School Musical: The Musical: The Series is a great example of how important music can be for representation. For a genre like musical theater that's so tied to queer experience and history, having an openly gay character sing as Sharpay is something I wish I had seen when I was singing Fabulous growing up, because I didn't just like Sharpay, I wanted to be like her. And it's no coincidence to me that these intimate moments of self-discovery were related to music, let alone musical theater. So having a song that mentions non-binary identities on a Disney show is the bare minimum, but it's also something. And things are much different than they were when I first started this channel. Back then, the closest Pride merch was the Rainbow line that came with vague statements like, "We offer a wide range of merchandise items that appeal to guests of diverse backgrounds." Though they donated a portion of the proceeds to Glisten, you wouldn't know that unless you went looking for that information. And as a queer person, that always felt to me like they wanted to pander to queer people without the repercussions that would come with acknowledging them more explicitly. Since then, a number of things have changed. In 2019, Disney hosted their first official Pride event through Disneyland Paris, and has been rolling out more explicit Pride-themed things at the US parks, though they still haven't turned the unofficial Gay Days celebrations into an official event yet. As a company with international appeal, Disney is likely aware of the different ways that they come off to different audiences. The fact that they had an official Pride event in Paris as opposed to the US parks doesn't seem like a coincidence. As Disney rolls out their most obvious line of Pride merchandise yet that also donates proceeds to a variety of LGBTQ charities and organizations, I don't really have any notes. As far as what Pride merch would look like for Disney, that's pretty much what I would have suggested in 2019. However, it's always a mixed bag, and while that is a great step in the right direction, this happened around the same time that Cruella was released. This idea might not be something exclusive to Disney. When you have corporations whose main goals are to turn profits, their interactions with social issues are usually problematic at best. But I think when talking about Disney and queerness, it becomes very interesting. Because while Disney is taking legitimate steps to build positive relationships with queer communities, they're also a company that's in a unique situation. Since its creation, for many people, Disney has been synonymous with family values.
America's Family Network, the Disney Channel.
As a queer person, even the phrase family values feels threatening. After all, it's been weaponized in US American culture to disparage queer people and play into the centuries-old stereotypes that queer people pose a threat to tradition and by association the fabric of society. But from Walt Disney's perspective, he was likely preserving what he thought were US American ideals. He wanted to create family-friendly entertainment that everyone could enjoy. But at the end of the day, his idealized society spoke to who he was as a conservative, white, cisgender, straight man. And as a result of this, he expressed some queerphobic attitudes. In an infamous example, during the production of Fantasia, when an animator told Walt that he was taking piano lessons to better understand music, Walt replied, "What are you, some kind of 2 years before Fantasia, Disney released Ferdinand the Bull, a short film about the Spanish story of the same name that talked about a pacifist bull who just wanted to smell flowers instead of fighting. But the titular song released with the film didn't just tell the original story, it painted Ferdinand as a sissy, associating his pacifism with weakness and homophobic stereotypes.
When the picador missed him, why, Ferdinand kissed him, for he never learned to fight.
I guess if you really wanted to, you could say that this is technically the first gay Disney kiss, but I don't really have the time or the emotional energy to give that much credit to a homophobic joke. This wasn't the only example of queer coding in early Disney, and it wouldn't be the last. I bring it up to show you an idea of how portraying queerness back then often began as a joke. Disney has a problem that other studios don't have. For other studios who have had problematic media in their pasts, re-releasing material with disclaimers or simply forgetting the past is usually the way to go.
Now, these prejudices were wrong then, and they are certainly wrong today.
But Disney's a bit different. They've already put up some disclaimers and are no stranger to reworking old attractions, but Disney's entire brand is the past. They can cherry pick and filter out any part of their history, but at the end of the day, their theme parks are still filled with their oldest movies, and those movies are still pushed as part of the Disney lineage. This is part of what makes the Disney brand so successful. Snow White is just as much of a classic Disney film now as it was in the late 30s, so both grandma and grandchild can connect over it and have nostalgia about it. In addition, creating theme park rides in the 21st century based on the movie helps maintain its relevance. At least, it's hard for me to think about other companies that are so successful at making old movies relevant for younger audiences. And I think having one foot in the present and one foot in the past is what makes Disney's modern relevance to LGBTQ culture so complicated. On one hand, they're reinventing their general image to make it more inclusive. But on the other hand, they can't escape their past. And perhaps most importantly, they don't want to. So, for fans of Disney, this involves watching a parade advertising one of Disney's new queer-inclusive shows just a short distance away from a statue of the man who once called an employee a f*** for learning the piano. This gets even more complicated when you consider that Disney's relationship to LGBTQ rights hasn't always been a linear progression. One of the main takes I see about Disney is that they've been homophobic but are more inclusive now. I think the notion that there was a moment where Disney switched over is problematic in itself, as I think it's far more nuanced than that. Sure, there are many queer-coded characters who are the butt of the joke in many Disney movies.
A child! Well.
But there have also been LGBTQ people within the company, such as Howard Ashman, who have created characters that are more explicit and provide some sort of representation. However, even in the recent documentary, they gloss over the fact that when he found out he had HIV, he was afraid to tell Disney.
Howard said to me, I didn't want to tell you because I didn't know how Disney would react. Here I am, a gay man, and I'm working on this movie for kids, and I didn't want to be fired.
But still, during the AIDS crisis, Disney had the first internal LGBTQ organization in Hollywood. However, even today, people like Alex Hirsch have been pretty candid about how Disney didn't allow any type of gay representation on shows like Gravity Falls. Disney now has multiple shows with openly gay characters, but they're usually hidden within Disney Plus and other niche markets that don't seem to mess with the mainstream perception of Disney. This year, Disney is collaborating with Nina West and other LGBTQ figures for Pride celebrations, and they have merchandise for Pride. But then there are characters like Artie that remind me about the don't ask, don't tell representation that's still prevalent in mainstream media. What does this all mean? Well, Disney likes money. That's not a surprise, nor is that unique for Disney. Any for-profit company naturally likes to maintain large audiences to expand their profits, and as social progress becomes more accepted in mainstream culture, it makes sense that businesses would capitalize on that. There's also the fact that there are plenty of queer employees within Disney. Certain policies stretching back to the 90s show Disney being more gay-friendly on an internal level, so it makes sense that eventually the dissonance between their internal image and their external image would be resolved. So it's complicated, and I think trying to glean a single sentiment of Disney is queerphobic or not queerphobic from that would be missing the point. Because that would ignore the fact that queer rights and LGBTQ culture don't inherently come with a political stance, and I miss that kind of nuance when I see these discussions. Growing up in a conservative queerphobic environment meant that I just assumed anyone who was LGBTQ had the same goals as me. But the more I learn about LGBTQ history, I learn that that is not remotely the case. And I think that applies to Disney. I think there's an impulse for many to view any queer person working within a company like Disney to be complacent or complicit in cis-heteronormativity. I understand where that point comes from, but I think it's also quite nuanced. Take Kenny Ortega, for example, someone whose work I admire dearly. He's an openly gay man who was framed for arrest in the early 70s for performing in a show that embraced counterculture and bisexuality. Someone who would go on to create many beloved queer-coded characters. But he was also someone who talked about having to queer-code characters as to not be at odds with the family-friendly values that Disney represented at the time. Who knows what happened behind the scenes, or if there were any discussions about making Ryan an openly gay character, but at the end of the day, that had to take a back seat. I think to take away from that Kenny Ortega is problematic and wasn't able to push enough for explicit LGBTQ representation would be a bit disingenuous, especially considering the things that he did do and the different political situations he lived through. Instead of making a dichotomy that queer people are either with the movement or against it, maybe we can talk instead about the complicated situation that for the last few decades, many LGBTQ people have tried to fight for their rights within the entertainment industry, but there were so many differing viewpoints on what that looked like. And if what we have doesn't look like the queer rights we deserve, let's talk about how we can change that and avoid compromise in the future. When I started this channel, the goal of talking about queerness and Disney was to reclaim agency. So much discussion about queerness in Disney is about their trajectory in acknowledging the gays in constructive ways. But the way I see it, queer people don't need a stamp of approval to enjoy Disney media. That's why there's been a considerable queer Disney fanbase since the company began. And to see people like Howard Ashman, Kenny Ortega, and Dana Terrace also recognize that appeal and try to be more explicit is also important for reclaiming agency and making constructive representation. So it's difficult to say where Disney will be in the future. As they more openly embrace the LGBTQ community, I hope they do it in a way that truly reflects the many queer people who make Disney happen in the first place. In other words, acknowledge their inherent presence by not allowing them to be cherry-picked or filtered out. But in the meantime, I'll keep watching High School Musical, the musical, the series. Because we need shows like that. Shows that don't inherently associate queerness with pain or struggle, but instead love. But I hope that was Disney's last first gay kiss. Ferdinand, Ferdinand, he smiled when the picador faced him. Ferdinand, Ferdinand, he winked and the picador chased him. Ferdinand, Ferdinand, he viewed the occasion so lightly. When the picador missed him, why Ferdinand kissed him, for he never learned to fight. When the picador missed him, why Ferdinand, oh, he kissed him.